Okay, title your notes, The Crash. This is still part of the Roaring Twenties, but we're going to title this The Crash. Where we left off, we were discussing Calvin Coolidge there with his Indian headdress and his Boy Scout uniform on. Comes to the election of 1928, and Calvin Coolidge decides not to run again. So we're going to see some new players here. For the Democrats, we see Alfred E. Smith. He was the governor of New York. Now, he had two distinct advantages. First of all, he opposed Prohibition. And in 1928, Prohibition was still basically the popular belief. That was the way people believed things should be run, and they liked the government putting an end to the distribution of alcohol. But he was also Catholic. They called him the Wet Catholic. And that didn't go in, the Catholics are still kind of looked upon as, having allegiance to the Catholic Church before all else. So we still have some of those things. And obviously, even today, we've only had one Catholic president in our history. So that was a disadvantage. The other candidate is Herbert Hoover. Okay, Herbert Hoover ran on basically the prosperity of the Republican Party under Calvin Coolidge. And he said things are going well, why change it? And Hoover wins in an absolute landslide. I think I have, oh no I don't, I thought I had a map there. Now that's not going to last for long though, because on October 24th, 1929, we're going to see the beginning of what we call the crash. Okay, the crash begins on this day. It's known as Black Thursday, where the stock market takes a big hit. On Friday, the government tried to step in and help, and it didn't work out. On Monday, things didn't go very well either. And then the big day is Tuesday, Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. $30 billion was lost in this one day. And I'm going to show you this graph here, okay, just to give you an idea. Here's Dow Jones, here's the year. The higher it gets, the better it is. And, it jumps and it fluctuates. It's a market, okay? And you see we have some tremendous growth during this time period. And then especially we peak right there on that day, or close to that day, and then all of a sudden, bang, the bottom drops out. That is called Black Tuesday. Now, it's also important to note that even though we've lost $30 billion on this one day, okay, it wasn't everybody. Only 15% of our population owns stock. Only 15% of the population owns stock. So this would immediately hurt 15% of our population, and not everybody lost. So that takes into account, this wasn't this wasn't like everybody lost money. Okay, but what you got to think about it, if the rich companies lose money, it's going to filter down from there. So 50% of the population owns stock at that point. Okay, and it's very important to note that during that same day, it actually gained a lot back. But it was that initial drop that people started to freak out. And I want you to look at this too. Okay, even at that initial drop, you see we build it back up. Okay, that was still higher than we were if you just go across like this a year ago. So people panicked is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so 30 billion was lost in that one day. That is called Black Tuesday. Black Tuesday. Now the causes of the crash. Okay, there are many different causes of the crash besides just the stock market. First of all, it's called the Florida land bubble in 1925. Okay, The Florida land bubble, people were buying up land in Florida. The problem was, that's great investment. The problem is they were buying land that was actually swamp, and it was backfilled with dirt. And that's not good, okay? And they're trying to build these structures on this dirt that is basically at the foundation of a swamp. Well, then in 1925, a hurricane comes in and floods the area, and literally people lose everything. Okay, the land was flooded where the swamp was filled in. I mean, that property is gone. So the land bubble burst. Not a good situation for people that invested there. A big reason, and probably one of the biggest reasons for the crash, is called overspeculation. Okay, also fraud too. People just started to begin to invest in the stock market, and the problem was some brokers were over speculating the price of that. They were inflating the price of the stock, so they were selling the stock high above of what it was really worth. Okay, and then as prices started to fall, people tried to sell that stock and found out that it wasn't worth nearly what they paid for. And people started selling that stock and started losing a lot of money in that way. Okay, when prices started to fall, people panicked and just sold their stock. Fraud too. Okay, there were fraudulent stocks out there where people were selling these stocks. Some didn't even exist. And that obviously is going to hurt the people as well, especially the people buying that stock, but also their faith in the system. Also, people bought, it's called buying on the margin. Okay, buying on the margin means people were borrowing money to buy stock. And more people began to do this. The problem is, when people were buying this stock from borrowed money from other stockbrokers or whatever, when those stocks started to drop and people were starting to sell them, it's called calling the margin. You would have to come in and pay what you owe right then and there, and people couldn't do that. So they started selling whatever they could, and it just started this huge wave of hysteria and panic. Propaganda as well. Newspapers told stories about people getting rich quick. Okay, and that did happen. It still happens today, but not very often. And people bought into that. So people that probably shouldn't have been buying stocks were buying stocks. Okay, and then the hysteria, the herd mentality, which we'll talk about in a minute with the run on the banks. Basically, people panicked. Okay, and that's the thing. People began to panic, and selling stocks where in actuality, if they would have just held off, not panicked, and held on to it, things probably would have been okay. Because like I said, things actually started to gain back in that same day. And a lot of people got rich off the crash. The Kennedys, for example, are probably the best example of this. Their family was buying during this time instead of selling. And so people will actually, and I'm not saying it's wrong to do that, but they were taking advantage of the situation and put their family in a very good position to buy these stocks that people were selling. So those were some of the things that we're going after. You know, and more people for the first time in their lives had spendable income, so they're trying to make more money and putting it into the stock market. So those are the reasons for the crash. And at the same time, we still have an agricultural depression going on. And if you remember, we talked about that after the demand for food lessened after World War I. You have this stockpile of goods that are basically going to rot. And the farmers take a big hit. Okay, and that's going to be one of the main issues during the Depression is farm prices, and we'll see how we handle that. But you can see how the farm prices decline during this time period. So that's a major issue as well. Industrial overproduction. We talked a little bit about this already with the end of World War I, when we have the surplus of goods. Once again, unequal, and I can put this in every era that we talked about. Unequal distribution of wealth. Just to be honest with you, if we had an equal distribution of wealth, that would be called communism in the pure sense, which doesn't exist. So will we ever see this? Probably not. But we do see a growing gap between the rich and the poor. The high tariffs, European depression. Okay, one thing that we try to do, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, it's called a Hawley-Smoot tariff, and I'll put it on the thing in a second. But we try to protect American goods to try to get us out of the depression, and it backfires. Because if we put a high tariff on American goods, or on imported goods coming into our country, what do you think the other countries are going to do to our goods? And it actually stifles trade. So that's not going to work out. Okay, trade drops, and the depression spreads to Europe as well, and that causes some other issues as well. So in 2 years, 25 countries try to cut down American imports because of that tariff, and we'll talk more about that in a second. And there just wasn't a lot of industrial growth, guys. So, there was we kind of peaked during World War I. There wasn't a lot of room to go at this point, so things weren't real good. All right, the immediate problems, obviously, number one, unemployment. Okay, the companies that took a hit are going to close down. They're going to really struggle during this time period, so they closed shop. In 1929, we have, and I won't ever expect you to remember these specific numbers, but 1929, we had 1.5 million people unemployed. Okay, that was 3%. That's pretty good. As a result of the crash, in 1930, 4.2 million. That jumps up to 9%, which is about where we are today. A little bit higher. About 10%, I think we are today. 1932, that number goes to 12.6 million. And this will be the highest ever. This is the highest unemployment rate, 25%. That is, 1 in every 4 people are unemployed in the workforce. So things are terrible. That is the immediate problem. Okay, our GNP, the gross domestic product, or gross national product, you can see how it jumps up here. If you can enlarge that, you can see, bang, takes a big old hit, and then we start to build it back up. That is the Great Depression right there. The gross national product, gross domestic product, is the total annual value of goods and services that we produce. In 1929, it's 104 billion. 1930, almost cut in half, 56 billion. No growth. Okay, we're in the trillions today. And the farmers, an influx of foreclosures. 1929, $13 billion, and is their income. And then as a result of the depression, $5.5 billion. Okay, on top of the depression, on top of everything else, a huge storm, a dry, arid time in our country called the Dust Bowl occurs. This is a picture of a farm down in a homestead in out west. That is a cloud of dust. The dust covers everything, kills crops. Just a terrible time for farmers during this time. So not only do you have farm prices dropping, but on top of it, the farms are being destroyed by the Dust Bowl. So not good. The banks. Bank failures. Run on the banks. In 1931, we see over 1,000 banks fail. 1932, over 2,000 banks fail. And in 1933, 5,000 banks fail. So, not good in this sense. Okay, and the run on banks, back then, if the bank closed, you didn't have your money, you're out of money. And once again, people freaked out. People panic. This is called the herd mentality. One person comes up and says, well, I'm going to withdraw all my money. I don't trust the banks. And then that word spreads. You got to remember, when you take your money to a bank, it's not in a separate compartment for just you. Okay, the bank takes your money and then it's spread out between other people, loans and things like that. It doesn't actually have a separate compartment just for you. And when everybody wants their banks at the same time, or wants their money out of the bank at the same time, that does not bode well for the bank. So things do not go very well in that sense. So those will fall. The banks will fail because of that herd mentality. It only takes one person to begin a panic, and that's what happens. Housing and food. Loss of dignity. People lose their homes. Could not put food on the table. Just a really rough time, and it's hard for us. My grandparents grew up during this time. I'm obviously a little bit older than you guys, so it's hard to really grasp this. But things were absolutely terrible for these people that lost their jobs. And then that wage structure that we've worked so hard to build up, destroyed. Because people are willing to work for anything at this point just to have a job. Okay, that is where we will stop today. 5 Q&A. Stay classy, Vandalia.